19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920, gave women the right to vote. In more precise terms, it said that citizens should not be denied the right to vote on account of sex. And now here we are, 2020, 100 years later after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Let me first talk about what happened in the West, because that was a very important precursor. At the time that we had all the women in the East campaigning for equal rights, the West had already moved ahead. And so most of the Western states had ratified or given women the right to vote long before the 1920 time of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So why did that happen out West? Well, there were a lot of reasons. First of all, there was the population imbalance. There were a lot more men out West than there were women. And for very personal and pragmatic political reasons, some of the men thought if we could get more voters, that would help them get elected. Different segments would get elected. The other thing that happened out West that was important was the coalition of women and the farm labor movement. And that, I think, was a very important coalition that moved things in the West. Of course, something else you have to think about in the West is that many of the women who moved west were more educated, and they were more committed to giving themselves equal rights because they were operating in a frontier environment. And it was very different. Of course, we had Alaska, which was literally the last frontier. You had Wyoming that had a lot of space. So most of these places had a lot of space and very little population. Some people think, well, it must have been motivated by good deeds that women got the vote. But sometimes it was actually somewhat racist, because there was a view in some segments that if African Americans had the vote and that Chinese had the vote, how could you not give the vote to women? So that, I would say, is kind of a backhanded way of moving into adopting some of these early states in the West.
It's definitely an incredible time to be celebrating this right for women. But I hope as we celebrate, we also remember the history of how that right was secured. And so when we think about our nation's history, often as we have progressed toward that more perfect union, that progression has happened by leaders who were sometimes flawed themselves. And that was certainly true of the suffrage movement. So I think about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who absolutely believed in universal suffrage. And yet, if pressed, if she had to choose, she would have said, well, white women's right to vote is superior to an African American right to vote. Now, it's important for us, I think, as we celebrate the right for all women to vote, to remember the history of how that was secured. You know, as another example of that, in the 1913 March on Washington, there was a question about whether white women and black women would march together, whether it would be integrated. And one of the main leaders, Alice Paul, said, I think it should be segregated. Black women should march at the back. And Ida B. Wells wouldn't have that. She jumped in and other states marched in an integrated way. And I mention that because as we think about our continuing American project toward equality and a more perfect union, we still have a ways to go. And so my hope is that in celebrating women's suffrage and the right to vote, that we remember that it came out of a history that still really reflects a lot of racial tensions that exist today. And as much as we celebrate this, we should also use it as a moment to consider what's our role and what's our next step toward equality for all people.
2020 is a very important year with the centennial, but it gives us an opportunity to reflect on what does the right to vote mean now, 100 years later. I think of Martin Luther King and his very poignant statement about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It's taken a long time, but of course we're beginning over these 100 years to see some major advances in women's rights. Very interesting, 2020, Virginia passed and ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. Some would say a little too late, but it's a very important symbol. At the same time, we need to reflect on all of the other ways that equality needs to be represented in our society. Of course, we have a whole series of legislation that relates to equality and includes not only women, but minorities and others. But we're also turning to the courts. And the courts have become a very important institutional development in equal protection and what it means in protecting women and protecting everyone on account of or on the basis of sex.
When we're trying to explain how the 19th Amendment happened at all, I think that goes to this experiment in the United States where we are here, we the people, and although we haven't and we are still working toward true equality for all, it has been, perhaps more slowly than some would want, a constant progression forward in that way. And so I think seeing the 19th Amendment come to fruition 100 years ago and celebrating it now, that's all a part of what makes being part of this American Democratic Republic experience. And however wonderful or flawed it may be, it is a form of government that allows for something like the 19th Amendment to happen.